Greetings and welcome. I'm Daniel Jacobson. I'm a professor of philosophy here at CU Boulder, and I'm director of the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization. Our mission at the Benson Center is to promote the study of Western civilization and to increase intellectual and political diversity on campus and outside it. The moderator today is going to be Matt Burgess. Matt's been a faculty fellow of the center for years. He's currently an assistant professor at CU. He's been poached away from us by the University of Wyoming, which is a coup for him. It's a great loss for us. Matt is maybe the most courageous academic that I know personally. He's an assistant professor. I mentioned that he was assistant professor because that means that he does not have tenure, and yet he has never shied away from expressing his views to the administration of the university, to students, to us, to everyone. He says what he believes, whether people want to hear it or not, and we need more of that. I admire that more. I admire that tremendously, and I think we need more. I'm really sad to be losing Matt, but I'm looking forward to having some inter-university partnerships with him at Wyoming. He's done great work for us at the Benson Center and for CU generally. So please help me welcome and thank Matt for all of it.
Thanks, everybody. And before we get to our main event, I also want to mark the occasion of my last event here at the Benson Center. The Benson Center is a really special place. It's, academia is supposed to be all about learning new ideas and grappling with new ideas. And I think this center, more than any, is really good at bringing that. It's sometimes strange as a middle-of-the-road Canadian to feel like my views are interesting at all. I think they're pretty boring and Canadian, except my views on guns, which are very interesting in America, but boring in Canada. And so I'm just really grateful that the Benson Center exists. It seems like it's stronger than it's ever been, and that's going to continue. And so I'm excited to only be 2 hours up the road and to be a frequent visitor and crasher of your parties. Okay, on to the main event. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Benson Center, to Colorado Mesa University, and to Head Rocks Academy's campus community chapters at here and at CMU for co-sponsoring this event. We're here to talk about the importance of patriotism. Being proud to be American here in America. What a snooze this should be. Why are we all here? This is one of the safest, most prosperous, freest, and most diverse and inclusive, I should say, societies in the history of the world. Our biggest flaws are found everywhere else, and they're almost always worse than they are here, and our biggest strengths are found almost nowhere else. So, of course we should be proud of ourselves, right? Yet somehow this conversation in 2024 feels not boring. The fraction of Americans who are extremely proud to be American is near a record low, 39%, according to Gallup, down from 70% in the mid-2000s. On one political extreme, we had protesters in the streets of New York City this week wearing Hamas headbands, flying Hezbollah flags, and chanting "Death to America." And there have been similar scenes in other major cities here and around the world, I'm sorry to say, including Canada. On the other extreme, we had a group of self-proclaimed patriots storm the U.S. Capitol and try to stop the peaceful transfer of power on January 6, 2021. And on campus, it sometimes feels weirdly edgy to talk about patriotism, like you might get hauled into a DEI office, which may or may not have happened to me once. So we're clearly confused. And I, as a frequent watcher of Bill Maher, have learned that if you're confused about something as a society, you need a comedian to straighten you out. And so we are honored and excited to have Konstantin Kisin here to help us do just that. Besides being a comedian, Konstantin is the host of the TRIGGERnometry podcast, not related to geometry, I should say, for those of you who are interested. See, this is why I'm not a comedian. And relevant to tonight's topic, author of the book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. Joining him, we have our mutual friend, Chris Barnard, who is the president of the American Conservation Coalition, or ACC. The ACC is an organization started by young conservatives who wanted to bring constructive voices and ideas to the environmental movement and to issues like climate change. They see environmental problems as problems that will take all of society working together to solve. And my hunch, which I'm exploring in my research, is that less division and more patriotism and more of a can-do attitude is important to seeing that happen. I saw Konstantin speak powerfully at Chris's ACC conference last June and thought we should get him here. So I'm keen to talk to you both about how we can build strong, constructive forms of patriotism. What distinguishes non-constructive from constructive forms, if anything? You're welcome to disagree with the premise of that. And what role patriotism should play in our problems. So starting with you, Konstantin, you wrote An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. What is the West and why do you love it?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming. Now I have the experience of what a college professor feels like, where the room is half full and everybody sits kind of away from the stage. And it's good to see so many young people here as well. Welcome, all three of you. There's one young man in the front taking notes for a project. He's not here for any passion or reason. He's just doing work. Anyway, what is the West? Well, look, I've just come back from Australia, actually. And Australia is obviously the perfect definition in many ways of what the West is, because it's a country that's not in the Western Hemisphere. It's a country that's surrounded by countries with a completely different culture. And if you understand the history of how Australia was created, basically Britain sent a bunch of convicts over 200 years ago, sort of left them to their own devices, and now you've got a flourishing country to which people from every surrounding country will risk their lives to come. And I don't think there's a better way of understanding the miracle of Western civilization than that. That it is, and by the way, if you look at, generally speaking, countries in hot climates, they don't tend to create thriving industrial civilizations, because if the food is falling off the palm tree in your mouth, you don't really have to do very much. If you look around at countries that have succeeded in those sorts of climates, they're very often countries that have that Western tradition that's been passed down. Now, if you're asking me where that comes from, well, we are the inheritors of the traditions of the Western Roman Empire. That's fundamentally where we've come from. As for the values, I mean, one of the things obviously that would be undeniable is the Christian, Judeo-Christian history of our societies and the values that come from that. But what ultimately comes from that, and at a political level, is a number of things that are the bedrock of our success, I would say. First of all, it's freedom of expression, and it's not some kind of abstract value. Now, we've got to a point with that issue where we treat it as a moral value. Either we have free speech and then we're good, or if we don't have free speech, then it's bad. Actually, free speech is a very important tool at every level of our societies. I mean, our armies fight better because we have a much less hierarchical society. So that means that information from the soldier on the ground can be passed up to people in command. Obviously, science is impossible without freedom of expression, as we're increasingly finding out now. You see academics who are essentially unable to pursue what they want to and pursue the truth because they're no longer able to speak. That means our ability to research things is going to be impeded too. So freedom of expression is a bedrock of it. There are all sorts of other things that go with that. I gave a bunch of talks in Australia on this very issue. I mean, it starts with freedom of expression, and we can maybe delve into other stuff, but I think that's a very good starting point for the conversation that we're going to have.
Great, yeah. Yeah, I would say, add to that freedom of expression, rule of law, free and fair elections, market competition.
Well, right, and so,
what did I miss?
Well, I think you have to understand, first and foremost, for people in America, that what you mean by rule of law partly is about private property, and this feeds into capitalism. We can talk about this in more detail. But what people in the West don't understand is private property does not exist almost anywhere else. And that sounds like a crazy statement to make. In Russia, if you're a billionaire, you're only a billionaire as long as you are serving the people above you.
In the good graces of...
In the good graces of the regime. And what that means is if you think about what capitalism, the idea of capitalism is if I serve you, if I provide something of value to you, I will be rewarded for that. And what it creates is a virtuous cycle of us serving each other and benefiting from that. In a non-capitalist system, like the one that I grew up in the Soviet,
just for audience,
the Soviet Union, the incentive structure was that it wasn't about serving your fellow man, it was about serving the regime. And so you get perverse incentive structures when you don't have rule of law and you don't have private property. Capitalism is a very powerful system for generating progress for the obvious reason that if you align the incentive structures correctly, people are massively incentivized to then pursue things. So give you an example. Gunpowder invented in China, right? But everything to do with firearms, almost everything is invented in the Western world because we have the incentive structure to take ideas and convert them into practical things that are of benefit to us and our societies. It's one of the reasons we've been so dominant around the world. So rule of law, capitalism, private property, and freedom of speech, those are the core kind of political values, I would say, of the West.
Great. Chris, what makes you proud to be American? You're the only American on this stage, I should say.
Well, and even then, I'm only half American.
Yeah.
I was born in Belgium, and it kind of strikes me as an interesting conversation having someone who was born in the Soviet Union, lives in the UK, someone from Canada who lives in the US now. I was born in Belgium, 17 years, lived there, then went to the UK, lived there for 5 years, and moved to DC 4 years ago. My dad's Dutch, my mom's American, so I feel I'm maybe half qualified to answer that question. But I think really one of the things that strikes me most about the American experiment and kind of the expression of what you guys just talked about is the extent to which in America there's a founding moment for that. Right? Like 4th of July, 1776, there was a moment around which Americans can rally. It was the beginning of a new era, of a new country. We could build it in the way that we wanted to. There were inalienable principles that were set at the very foundation of that we built off of. And it was truly an experiment like we didn't see anywhere else in the world, right? And I think that's part of the reason why America has been so successful as a country. And part of why it's to some extent unraveling now is because people for most of American history really held on to the American founding. Like every year on the 4th of July, American flags everywhere. It didn't matter if you were left wing or right wing, didn't even matter what your religion was. You were celebrating the core pre-political founding of this group of people living in the same place. And I think that really is what makes America special. It's about communities understanding that they have relationships with one another that come before their political relationship. They have communal relationship, they have spiritual relationship, economic relationships. And I think in a lot of other places around the world, you look at France right now, their relationships between communities are almost defined by the politics of it all. There's a secularization that has taken away so much of what makes a country like France unique. And in the US, we've been able to hold on to what makes us unique. And we've understood the proper ordering of authority and hierarchy. Like, yes, there is a federal government, but there's also a state government and a local government. And then there's the church and your community, your family, the individual. And we understand that each and every one of those has a different role to play. And my point about it unraveling a little bit nowadays, and I think that's part of what we're talking about, is this sense of a lack of belief in what makes us special. I think we're seeing that across the West, but in America as well. Like, you've seen the attack on the American founding as being racist or founded on colonialism. And I think a lot of people nowadays, young people in my generation, I'm 25, are looking at that and they don't feel proud to be American anymore. They don't feel proud to be Western anymore. And I think that's a very big problem. And I'm sure we'll talk more about what that looks like. But as soon as a country or a group of people lose that pre-political sense of relationship, I think everything else is downhill from there.
So I had a bunch of easy questions that I was going to go through before we go there, but let's go there. So two of the challenges with patriotism today, one of them is what you just alluded to. So I think it would probably be fair to say that in 1776, it was not true that all men were created or were treated as though they were created equal in the United States, right? Slavery, and then Jim Crow after that. And so the idea of, America as an unfinished promise, I think is what I can't remember if that's Obama who said that, but how can we make American patriotism have enough room to improve the country, right? To build a more perfect union, as many people say, without just being down on it to the point where it frays the social fabric.
Yeah, I can start maybe, and then you can chime in. But my favorite quote from the British philosopher Edmund Burke is that a good statesman has the propensity to preserve and the ability to improve. I think that's something that we've actually seen in America. We've set in motion certain institutions, certain values, certain laws that we believe should exist throughout history: the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. But we've also built into that system the ability to improve and to get better. And I think very much we have to separate kind of the sinful, flawed people that started the founding and the ideas of the founding itself. And I think Thomas Jefferson's words that every man is born with inalienable rights given to him by his creator is no less true because he owned slaves or not. I think that idea is either inherently correct or it's inherently wrong, and we should be judging it on the merit of itself. And we saw a lot of the American founders struggle with that themselves. Like Washington, at the end of his life, he freed all of his slaves because he understood that there was a moral dilemma there. But I think what we've done in American society in modern times, especially on campuses, is take that too far. Jefferson and Washington owned slaves, therefore everything they did was wrong. The entire project that they started was wrong. And I think a lot of people are looking at that and going to the extremes. And of course, we need to reckon with this original sin of American history. But we also need to understand that the very people that set it in motion also set in place the ability to improve through the systems that they created, and they allowed future generations to solve the problems that were unable to be fixed at that time.
Konstantin, what's your take? And feel free to broaden this to the UK context too.
Well, first of all, I'm going to say a few politically incorrect things. Let me come back to why people should be patriotic. I mean, I think the points you made are absolutely right, but I think at the core of it, you just have to say something that's true, which is our countries are better. I mean, empirically speaking, I'm not just saying that because I have a British accent and you have guns. I mean, our countries are better. No, but seriously, look at where are people fleeing and where are people going to?
Right, reveal.
Why are millions and millions and millions of people attempting to get into the United States, many of them risking their lives to do so? Right? Why is that happening? Why are tens of thousands of people risking their lives to get across the Mediterranean into Europe? Why are they risking their lives to get across the English Channel into the UK? It's not by accident. It's not because they just woke up one day and decided, well, what if I just get on the boat and there's a 20% chance I'd die? People don't do that unless they have a good reason. So number one, we have to accept, I almost use the word admit, because that's kind of where we are, that our societies are better. They are better at creating the things that people seem to want. Prosperity, freedom, safety, right? That's basically what people are coming to our countries for. So first and foremost, we have to be able to acknowledge that the societies we live in are the best societies in the history of humanity, right? And I think if we acknowledge that, it's not hard to be patriotic from there. You'd sort of want to preserve the best society in the history of humanity. As for the other point, I think we have to, one of the things that has really happened, it's absolutely terrible in Western societies, is the way that history has been taught and completely misrepresented. And this is It happens in the UK and in the US on every issue. I mean, let's take the issue of slavery, for example, right? The woke narrative on slavery is there was no slavery, right? And then the evil British people came along and invented slavery, right? And then woke people came along and ended slavery. Right? That isn't what happened. What happened is everyone everywhere throughout history had slaves. Slaves were the first commodity that human beings ever traded, most likely, from what we know. So everybody everywhere had slaves, and then the British came along. They practiced slavery just like everybody else because they were technologically advanced. They were more sophisticated at it. And then they ended it. And not only did they end it within the British Empire, they spent 150 years patrolling the high seas, losing tens of thousands of men and blood and treasure to stop it. Now, how does that make the British, in this context, the guilty ones? Like, I give this example in my book. Imagine 20 years from now, if you have to, because the vegans are going to win. Imagine the vegans, they win, and we get to the point where we believe that consuming animals is the worst crime that human beings could ever commit, right? And let's say America leads the way in abolishing that trade. Would we say that the Americans, or the British, if it was the British, were the worst people that ever lived? Or would we say they're the first ones that ended this terrible practice?
I guarantee you the Americans will not lead that practice. But,
I agree with you. Thank God. I mean, I've just spent 2 weeks on tour with Jordan Peterson, so I've eaten more steak than I think possible. But anyway, so, and likewise in the United States. Now, look, we should be clear that the practice of slavery and everything that happened after that, Jim Crow, it's awful. Absolutely awful. But even on that, there's a fundamental misunderstanding. I mean, one of my greatest heroes is a guy called Thomas Sowell, and he, in several books, breaks all of this down. People talk nowadays about how America was founded on racism. No, it wasn't. It wasn't. It absolutely wasn't. In fact, it was your Constitution that forced you to invent racism to justify slavery. That's what happened. You had slaves, and that was clashing with the idea that all men are created equal, which is why people invented scientific theories about why racism was justified. Right? And eventually, the promise of that idea was delivered. Right? Does that mean that we should be proud of treating black people well? No, of course not. But everything has to be understood in the historical context in which it happened. Right? So I just think the first thing we need to do is start teaching history properly. That would take us a long way to solving many of these issues.
So you've given a great answer on how can you reconcile being patriotic with accepting that your society is not perfect. And if I could summarize in a sentence, that your not perfect society is better than every other society in the history of the world.
Well, let's put it like this.
Let's go to the other.
Let me just
Sure, yeah.
jump in. Simply put, if you're a woman, you're an ethnic minority, you are gay, you are whatever, where would you rather live?
Right.
Russia?
Maybe Canada, but I'm just kidding.
I mean, look, you do have
I'm
your first black prime minister, so that is admirable. But
This is why you need a comedian.
I'm just saying, if you're objective about it, if you want to talk about sexism or racism or homophobia or whatever, would you think you'd rather be gay in Russia? Or China? I mean, where are these magical utopian places that we compare ourselves to?
So, very well taken. Let's talk about the flip side. How do you reconcile being proud and recognizing that this is the best society or the best group of societies that have ever existed, with also wanting to make those societies better in any way that you may want to make them better?
Look, I'm proud of my wife. I don't think she's perfect. That's how you be proud of things. You don't have to be perfect to be. Someone doesn't have to be perfect for you to be proud of them, and your country doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be ideally the best country in the world, which this country is, right? And it has to be striving to get better. But I don't think that I say this often. If you talked about your spouse in public the way people talk about their country in public, people would call you an abuser.
Yeah, right. That's
right?
a good point.
So if I was berating my wife in public for something she did 20 years ago as a way to improve her, Nobody would accept that as a reasonable thing to do. Yet when it comes to your country, that's exactly what happens.
Well, I'm not going to ask you how you do want to improve your wife, because that seems inappropriate.
It's impossible, man.
So let me ask both of you. You know, I was aware of some of your work, but the thing that really kind of brought you to my attention was your Oxford Union speech about climate change. For those of you who haven't seen it, go look it up. And one of the things that you say is basically there's no way to solve this or any other big problem without working, creating, and building. I'm paraphrasing somewhat. And too many people seem to forget that. My hunch is that patriotism, that our need to rediscover our patriotism and our need to rediscover the value of working, creating, and building are related. What are your thoughts? Either of you.
I've been speaking for like half an hour. You go.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. You spoke at our summit last year, and you made the case that, and it's kind of building on your Oxford Union speech, that the current kind of quote-unquote woke approach to climate change is a lot more ideological than it is practical, and that it's actually not even successful. And if you look at, for example, what Germany's done, taken an entirely ideological approach to these issues, where they shut down their nuclear plants, they shut down their fossil fuel production, and they said, we'll just go to wind and solar, and that'll solve the problem. And we see a few years later, of course, they completely started relying on Russia to import all of their energy needs rather than being able to use that themselves. And I think that's just a perfect example of how this issue is something that's just captured the ideological zeitgeist of people that think about this in an abstract way rather than in a practical way. The way that you solve society's biggest problems is by unleashing innovation, empowering entrepreneurs to build and come up with the solutions. To your point about putting things into action, like the Chinese might have come up with the gunpowder, but we made the guns that allowed that to be used. I think in a very similar way, when it comes to tackling problems like climate change, fundamentally it's a technological problem, and so you want to empower the best ideas to go about tackling that problem. The way that you do that is by incentivizing creativity, by giving people the opportunity to come up with something cool and new, bring it to the marketplace, test it out, compete with other technologies, and do it that way. The mainstream kind of left-wing approach has been completely about controlling society from the top down, by having certain pre-built outcomes that they wanted to achieve and trying to actually retrofit that onto those solutions rather than saying, here's a problem, let's make society figure this out through entrepreneurialism and through hard work. And I think at the end of the day, patriotism is core to that. Right now, we're essentially relying almost completely on China for a lot of our clean energy needs. And a lot of people think, well, if I'm going to be forced to drive an EV, why would I do that if that's an EV that's being built in China? Why can't I have that EV be built here in the US and create jobs for my community and be proud of the fact that this is American innovation? And a lot of people just aren't at all impressed with the mainstream climate approach, where it's about abstract things like parts per million and 2050 net zero targets, and invisible particles like carbon dioxide. Why can't we talk about things that are relevant to people's daily lives? If you're a farmer in the Midwest and climate change impacts through weather patterns your crop yields, that's directly something that impacts you and your community. If you're in Florida and you're experiencing rising sea levels, that's something that impacts your community. If you're here in Colorado or Utah and you see the impact on hunting seasons, you see the impact on the ski industry, those are things that are directly personal to people, and we've made this conversation so abstract that people have no reason to really be bought into it. But if you make it something personal to them, that's when they get bought in, and we found in our work that kind of leading with America can do this. We put people on the moon, we put the internet in the palm of our hands, and now we can solve a problem as complex as climate change because we are the most ingenious, innovative country that the world has ever seen. That's the way that you get people motivated to tackle this, rather than an abstract, oh, we got to do it because we got to have net zero by 2050 and cut carbon dioxide. This is not an inspiring message to most people.
So one quick follow-up question for you, Chris. With all due respect to British landscapes and weather, America has some pretty amazing landscapes. We're going to go see some of them tomorrow. Chris, how do you think about the physical geography of America as part of both your patriotism and your environmentalism?
Yeah, I mean, one of my big heroes is Teddy Roosevelt, who's the founder of the conservation movement in this country. The reason that he became a conservationist is not because he read the scientific literature and he became convinced and that's why all of a sudden he wanted to protect the environment. It's because he went out and lived on a ranch in North Dakota for years. He worked on the ranch, he was on horseback for a lot of it, and he came face to face with the incredible natural beauty that we have here in the United States. And I think you live in the most beautiful state in the union, in my opinion. My wife's from Colorado, so I have to say that.
He says that in every state.
But here I'd mean it. But I honestly can't imagine anyone that looks at the mountains in Colorado or looks at a herd of bison and can't think like, wow, I want to protect that. That's just so beautiful. Let's do something about protecting that. And I think that's why they call the national park system America's best idea, right? So many people come face to face with the outdoors, and one of the most amazing things about American history is that we tamed the outdoors. You see people being able to go to Yellowstone National Park where there's a geyser and there's wolves and there's bison, and they can drive around and visit this natural beauty, and they can camp there and they can hike there. We've tamed the great outdoors, but that means we also have a responsibility to protect it. And I think that's something that the vast majority of Americans are wanting to do, but they don't buy into a lot of the abstract sacrifice your lifestyle for abstract climate goals kind of narrative.
Yeah, Konstantin, you said I think in your Oxford Union speech that anybody who's a parent, and the two of us are, if you had a button that could guarantee that your kids would be prosperous, but some carbon would be emitted, there's not a parent in the world that wouldn't press that button, right? Okay, I want to ask you. One of the things at Heterodox Academy that we very much value is constructive disagreement, steel manning, try to anticipate the other side. So I want to ask you a question in that spirit. The United States is very diverse. So, for example, 14% of the U.S. population was born in another country. 42% of the population and 53% of those under 18 in the United States identify themselves as either non-white, Hispanic, or multiracial. I get the sense sometimes that some people on both the far left and the far right, and I don't mean most people, I mean the far left and the far right, associate patriotism with white supremacy. I don't think any of us would endorse a patriotism like that. So is that just a totally crazy association? And what does and if so or if not, how do we make patriotism inclusive to the diversity of our societies?
Well, the first thing you have to understand about the far left, let's say, is that they don't use language to communicate. This is not my idea. Michael Malice, my good friend, explained this to me, and it maps perfectly onto what we see. They don't use language to communicate. They use language to manipulate. So when they say patriotism is about white supremacy, it's not true, right? It's just factually incorrect. I mean, the definition of patriotism is loving your country. How could loving your country be white supremacy? That doesn't make any sense, right? So first of all, it's just factually incorrect. Secondly, it's interesting you mentioned the statistics about what percentage of the population identify as white. I suspect that if we didn't have a situation in which some animals are more equal than others, let's put it that way, you'd find a lot of people, there's a reason that Elizabeth Warren identifies as Native American. It's not because she's Native American, it confers certain benefits, right? A lot of people now do this.
So
do you see what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying, but is it relevant to the claim that the United States is diverse? I would claim that,
no,
that
of
the
course
United States is obviously diverse,
Yeah,
whether or not there's some
absolutely.
manipulation around the edges.
But who is it that's telling my ethnic minorities, for example, that they are excluded from being patriotic? It's the far left. They're saying, this country doesn't like you, this country hates you. Is that the experience of normal people? I talk to normal people, that's not their experience at all. Most immigrants in this country and in the UK where I live say, I'm so glad I'm here, right? That's what people say if you actually talk to them. So who is it that's creating the narrative that you have to, the only way to love your country is to be a racist? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Right. So it's just factually incorrect. And none of this is, I know this seems like a simple point, but none of this is true. and that matters, right? So I think the thing that, as I said earlier, the thing that people can unite around in our countries is the country is great. Its values work. That's why it is what it is. And I say again, I mean, whatever your group and however quote unquote oppressed you think you are, and there are always people who are badly treated because of who they are, and that we should be stamping that out as much as we can, of course. But there is no better place to be from one of those groups than to be here. And if we stop pretending that that isn't true, we'd be a lot closer to having a cohesive society.
Well, let me take it a step further quickly, because the insinuation that white supremacy and patriotism might be synonymous is in and of itself actually really quite offensive to, like, black people, say, who might be genuinely proud to be part of America, who want to feel like they're part of this American project, who can celebrate the 4th of July, and to say that because of the color of their skin, they can't be proud of this country and the ideas that it stands for, is actually deeply offensive to those people, and racist in itself, in a genuine sense. That's racist, because you are defining ideas by racial categories rather than by whether the ideas are good or not.
So let me make a follow-up comment and then ask one more follow-up question, just steelman that position a little bit better. So first, a follow-up comment. It is true, I believe, in polls that immigrants are more patriotic than native-born Americans, and possibly like you know, it's because they've seen the alternative.
And also because they don't take it for granted.
And they don't take it for granted, right? So you're absolutely right that patriotism, you know, framing patriotism in that way glosses over patriotism that exists and in some cases exceeds our patriotism. But just to steelman the question, I think when it's asked sincerely, and I agree that there are some people that throw words like white supremacy around unsincerely, but when it's asked sincerely, I think it comes from people hearing people say things like, you know, we have these values which are better, which again I think you made a strong case for, but then they say, you know, these are Western, these come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. I think it's not hard to see how, again, I've seen it on the far left and on the far right, people make an extra leap there that's where that association comes from.
What's the leap?
The leap from Judeo-Christian to Western to having some kind of a racial undertone.
But the idea of Judeo-Christian, anyone can be Christian, anyone can be Jewish if they want to. You also don't have to be either to buy into the core ethos of that civilization. I'm not a believer, but I'm perfectly capable of living by the code of the Judeo-Christian societies that we've created. So again, it's just a lie. And this is the thing that, you see, it takes a while to get there, because in our desire to be charitable and understanding and patient and welcoming of different ideas and plurality.
All Canadian values, I should
Exactly,
say. Yeah.
well, exactly. What we sometimes are unwilling to see is the truth, which is that there is a section of the far left who are simply enemies of Western civilization. That's what they are. They don't want to create a better society. They don't want to improve the society. They want to destroy. That's the only thing they know to do. That's why all they do is whine. Right? Because they have no agenda for improving America. They just don't like America. That's what it is. And if you understand that, everything suddenly makes sense. One man agrees. 2 men, 3 men. Good.
And a woman.
Just men, women don't.
We haven't really gotten controversial enough yet. So let's talk about immigration.
And by the way, just to be clear, none of what I say about the far left is to say that the far right is brilliant. It's not. I mean, one of my big concerns about, see, I don't think a bunch of people with blue hair and septum piercings are going to destroy Western civilization. But what they will do is, what they're doing already, is they will put sufficient pressure on the institutions which they have captured to take the law and legislation and practical elements of government to a position, and you and I were talking about this at lunch earlier, which is you allow tons of illegal immigration, you allow rampant crime on the streets, and then the people are going to go, look, forget democracy, let's get someone in who's going to sort this out. That's the threat of the far left. So to say that the far left are enemies of the West is not to say that we love the far right. It's just these people are crazy, these people are crazy, and we need to keep both of them the hell away from power and control of our institutions. That's what a moderate position is. But see, people confuse being moderate in terms of your policy prescriptions with being moderate about identifying the truth. And the truth is, these people are enemies. That's just a fact. When you get that, then you can go, we better keep the enemies of our society away from the levers of power.
And another thing that your point gets at, I think, is that the extremes are, without realizing it, each other's best friends.
Of course, they've always been. That's what history shows you.
And I mean, to a visceral example of the point you're making, the communists agitating in pre-Nazi Germany is one of the things that helped the Nazis come to power.
Yeah.
Okay, but so immigration. You're an immigrant, I'm an immigrant, you're an immigrant, sort of.
Immigrants unite.
Yeah. So we like immigration at some level. Konstantin, you've sometimes spoken positively about immigration generally, but you've also taken some positions that have been critical of Britain's immigration policies as being too permissive, especially on illegal immigration. That's obviously an issue that's very salient in the US too. How should the UK, the US, and other Western countries set their immigration policies? Like, pursuant to what objectives?
Immediately suspend anything that allows any illegal immigration tomorrow.
Why not today?
Why not today? Because it's not going to happen today. Have you seen how quickly government works? So there should be zero illegal immigration into any of our countries. What we should be doing, if we want to welcome refugees from war-torn countries, which I think we would all want to some level, we should set up refugee processing facilities in the regions in which these conflicts are happening, process the people there, work out who's a legitimate refugee. You know, we have people in the UK who get to the UK, convert to Christianity, and then go and commit terrorist attacks that seem, you know, distinctly Islamic to me, right? We've got to make sure that we're letting people into our country, particularly if we're doing it out of the goodness of our heart and out of compassion, who are actually the people that need the help. And what tends to happen is the people that really need the help are the ones that aren't getting it, because they're often women, children, etc. And instead we allow, 80, 90% young men to come into our countries, most of whom, they're economic migrants, like me. The problem is, and it's a funny thing that it happens in the UK where like, jumping in front of the queue, the line, is like the worst offense you can make. And yet we're allowing people to do that. So there should be zero illegal immigration. And on legal immigration, we should be picking and choosing who comes here because we think that they're going to be the best people to contribute to our society. And if that means we welcome 10 million people a year and we have the infrastructure to welcome them, that works for me. I've got no problem with people coming if they speak the language, they're going to integrate, they're going to follow the values of our society, they're going to become true Americans or true British people. I don't care about people's race or skin color or whatever, if they're going to integrate, if they're going to contribute. So I think, particularly in a country like America where there's lots of space, if you're willing to build the infrastructure, you want talented, driven young people coming in from all over the world. Same in Britain. Britain is a little bit different because we've got a population of about 70 million people in a country smaller than what, New Jersey?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of it's a different situation. But even so, I'm all for controlled legal immigration where we choose the people that come on the basis that we think these are the best possible new Americans or the best possible new Brits. And that's the history of your country. These things, and by the way, you know, the thing that I find really crazy is, like, you all remember this, 20 years ago, everything I'm saying was the consensus position across both parties. Obama, I have a whole chapter in my book on this. Obama, Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer, all the left-wing politicians, all the right-wing politicians, everybody used to agree that countries need borders. Everybody used to agree that illegal immigration is wrong. Everybody used to agree that America is a nation of immigrants and we want to welcome more of them to contribute to our society as long as we choose who they are. And that's not what's happening. I was in LA a few months ago, and because I have a Russian name, all the Lyft drivers in LA are Armenian, literally every single one, right? And they all speak Russian. So I would talk to them. They would start a conversation. I would talk to them. Every single one of them that I talked to was there illegally. The guy was telling me about how he smuggled his 93-year-old father through the Mexican border.
And for those of you who don't know, Armenia is nowhere close to Mexico.
Yeah. That's a mild understatement. Armenia is next to Iran, right? So a lot of, and that's what's happening. Right? That isn't, when we talk about America being a nation of immigrants, I don't think that's what we mean.
Well, I remember my first ever college essay that I wrote was in a class about U.S. politics. I was in the UK, and I was a young, edgy person on campus, so I wanted to obviously go against whatever the professor was saying. And the question for the essay was, is America a country of immigrants? And obviously kind of the standard response is, yes, of course it's a country of immigrants. And my argument was that might technically be true. Logistically, it might be true. But philosophically, I actually don't think that's the right way to approach what America is. America is a country of ideas. It's a country of first principles that a group of people came together and established, and the expectation was that when you come to this country, you assimilate to those ideas. I think a country of immigrants kind of implies that, yeah, everyone came with their different thing and just went off and did their own thing. But no, like the expectation was you come and you are a part of America in a productive way. You celebrate the 4th of July and you plug into your community, and you might have your distinct cultural elements, whether it might be your cuisine or other holidays you celebrate or whatever it might be, the language you speak at home. There's no problem with that as long as you understand that this is a society that only functions when everyone's on the same cultural and philosophical page. And that's really what's been America's success for ever since 1776 and even before that. And one of the big problems when kind of your comparison about people wanting to come to the US are more patriotic than people that are growing up here is like, yeah, of course, if you're jumping in the ocean from Cuba and swimming to Florida because you want to have a safe life in America, you're going to be more patriotic than if you go to a college and you learn that 1619 is actually the founding of America when the first slave ship came here. And I think this idea that we're about principles rather than identities or rather than inalienable characteristics is so much more powerful, and frankly is the reason why America has been so successful. And I see in my generation an abdication of those ideas, and I think that's really the problem in the immigration debate. And we've seen how Europe has completely abdicated any sense of assimilation. Like David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister in the UK, proposed a very commonsensical policy, which was to offer free English classes to people coming from the Middle East that did not speak English. And that was lauded as racist, as cultural imposition on these people coming to the country. I mean, when is the expectation that you speak the same language as the people you live in the same country as somehow racist or colonial? And I think that's what's happened in most of Europe, and America is at risk of going in the same direction of giving up the concept of assimilation for the sake of cultural relativism and so-called tolerance.
So let's dig in on this.
May I make a couple of quick?
Yes, sure.
So let me just put this into numbers for you. Just the British example might be helpful. The founding of modern England, you might say, was 1066, which is the Battle of Hastings, which is when William the Conqueror invades from Normandy, defeats the English king, who just defeated the Viking invaders. 1066, it's 1,000 years ago. More people came into Britain between 1997 and 2008 than had come between 1066 and 1950. That is the scale of immigration. There are more people, there are almost as many people coming into Britain illegally this year than came legally the year that I came in 1995. So when I came,
I want to date you, but it would help.
1995, when I came to Britain, the net immigration into the UK was about 55,000 people. In 2022, we had 45,000 people come illegally, and 670,000 legally last year. So it's not just about, when we talk about immigration, you have to understand, like the great man Joseph Stalin said, quantity has a quality all of its own. And assimilation is only possible when the numbers are manageable for the country, when there's sufficient infrastructure, when there's sufficient teaching of the language, when you have the things in place to mold people together and to say, welcome, you are now part of the family. Whereas if people just live completely separately from each other, as they increasingly do, you're going to have a big problem.
So let me dig in on, you both mentioned the word assimilation, I heard integration before. So one of the interesting tensions that I see in research on this is that on the one hand, it is, the two metaphors are the melting pot and the salad bowl, right? The salad bowl is kind of multiculturalism. We completely don't integrate. Melting pot is we completely do assimilate. So the tension is, the research that I've seen in sociology and political science suggests that if we make the melting pot metaphor too strict, people end up internalizing that in ways that create xenophobia against minorities. Even though, like you said, there's nothing about American ideals that have anything to do with skin color. On the other hand, if we don't have a strong shared sense of identity, then we also have, the research in economics and political science and sociology suggests that we have trouble providing public goods. So how do we thread the needle between those two outcomes and create what some people call a dual identity or a supergroup identity, where, for example, I am from a racially blended family where we celebrate different holidays, but I joke that my wife is, even though her parents were immigrants, she's more Canadian than I am culturally, right, in certain ways. So how can we do that? How can we build a strong shared sense of identity that we probably do need to have a cohesive society without imposing a mold that's stricter than even we intend to?
Well, I don't think you can create.
What should we do?
Well, I think we should be imposing a mold that's sufficiently strict but doesn't go too far. I mean,
So where's the line?
Well, I suppose you'd have to give me specific test cases of what you're talking about. But for me, Chris articulated some of them, but the line about speaking the same language, right? That's very, very important. It's the glue that holds society together. There's no getting away from that.
I'll go back, sorry.
So that's one of the core principles. And then it's about, and this is particularly the case with Muslim immigration in the UK, for example, you have to be able to say that there are certain things that we do here and there are certain things that we don't do here. We don't create alternative legal systems in our society, right? We don't...
Sorry, can you expand on what you mean by that? Just because there are probably some members of our American audience who don't. I know what you mean.
And this is true of Jews, by the way, as well. I mean, there are some kind of courts that will litigate various elements of marriage and whatever, right? I'm against that. I think we should have one legal system, the English legal system or the American legal system. And there are people, obviously, as the Muslim population increases, there will be some people who advocate for Sharia law, for example, right? That's what's happening in the UK now with some people. I think we should be horrified by that. And not only because we have a problem with Sharia law, but because we have a problem with any external group bringing in their own legal system and attempting to impose it on society. And there will be all sorts of other things that we have to be quite clear about, that we have a certain way of treating women in our society, for example, right? There are certain things that are unacceptable in that area. There are certain cultural values that we have and don't have. These are all things that have to be negotiated one at a time. But what I think is important to recognize is there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, the great Thomas Sowell line. So when you push cohesiveness up, you inevitably will have to suppress difference to some extent. Those are the trade-offs. There's no getting away from that paradigm. There's no way of having everyone be the same or cohesively together and also be completely different. That's not possible. So we got to stop pretending. We all have to give a little bit of ourselves for the group. That's what it means to be a community. That's what it means to be a society. And that means I was born in Russia with all sorts of values that are at odds with the values of Western society, and I've had to adjust. That's what immigrants are supposed to do. You're supposed to adjust to the society in which you came, not turn up and decide that this is now the place where you're going to implement your values on the rest of that society.
Yeah, I think there's a few dynamics there, and everything you said was really good. The first thing is, I think often people like on the pro-Western civilization, pro-patriotism side of the debate, I think we see that the ground a little bit and have gone on the defense rather than on offense. We're like, oh, you kind of do have to learn the language. Like, please, will you learn the language? Rather than, yeah, this is the best opportunity you'll get to learn the language in a new country and be successful. Like, we should tell that success story and the optimism and the American dream, sell it, that everything that comes with that. And I think in so many conversations, whether it's on like climate change or on this issue, we just are on the defense rather than on the offense, and we should be actively telling our story. The second thing is that I really think there are two main aspects to being successful in terms of assimilating people into a shared culture. The first is obviously education, people like growing up and learning the foundational principles of America, whether it's like from the founding or our laws or the way our institutions work, those kinds of things. But the second thing, which I think America's actually historically been very good at, is like putting those into action. I remember when I was living in Belgium and I visited my mom's side of the family in Colorado in Pagosa Springs, and it was school time, and so I went with my cousins to school, and they all said the Pledge of Allegiance before class in the morning, and I was like kind of bewildered by it, like, well, what is this? And just knowing now that they were saying that Pledge of Allegiance every day before school growing up, didn't matter if they were black, brown, white, or whatever it might be, didn't matter if they're poor or rich, didn't matter where they came from, they were pledging allegiance to the flag of the United States of America every day. I know that's not something that is necessarily popular nowadays anymore in a lot of places, but I would have loved to grow up with that. I would have loved to have that bond between me and my classmates from such an early age. And another example of that is I play semi-professional soccer right now in DC, and every single time we step on the field before a game, we walk out and we sing the American anthem, both teams together, facing the flag and standing with our hands to our hearts. Like, that's how you build camaraderie. I mean, on that soccer field, football, sorry, didn't want to offend you. On that field, you have like every ethnicity, every national background, people that are poorer, people that are richer, every profession is represented there. But in that moment, you're all Americans. And you're all pledging allegiance to the same thing, to the same concept and idea before you go battle it out on the field afterwards. And I think that's something that we need to be a lot more capable of doing as a country. And if you look at all the European countries that are failing, it's because they A, lack the education, and B, they're unwilling to expressly, visibly show their pride in their country in the same way that you have an American flag on every doorstep.
Two follow-up questions. One is, how much of this, particularly in countries like the United States that are, nations of immigrants, or Canada, is just solved by time? So for example, there's a famous study that looks at by Robert Putnam, who's a really famous scholar at Harvard. who shows that the diversity and various measures of social trust at the neighborhood level are negatively correlated. And then there was a study in Canada that looked at a similar question, but separated people out by age. So this came out in 2013, and they found that for older Canadians, the diversity of your social network was negatively correlated with your trust, like it was in the US. But for younger Canadians, it was the other way around. And that resonated really strongly with me I didn't participate in the study, but I am part of the cohort of younger, that would have been in the younger Canadians, is that, we had a huge wave of immigration in our parents' generation, right? And if I think about, my parents and my in-laws are wonderful people, but they're really different, right? It's sort of hard for them to be really, really close in the way that it would be easier to be if they were culturally closer. And yet my wife and I and our friends, when we were in college, Toronto was already a majority-minority city. There were literally people born in every country but two. Somebody tried to figure this out for an art project. It was like Nauru and some other island, right? And so we had a shared identity. It was normal. It wasn't weird that we were all from, our parents were all from different places, but we definitely had a shared Canadian culture that left room for us also to have our ancestral aspects of our ancestral cultures. I read an article a few years ago that argued that California has had a similar experience, that there was a ton of immigration in the 1990s, people freaked out a little bit about it, and now, not only
they're all leaving the state.
Not only is the temperature lower, but also, for example, to your point about that, Chris, that you made earlier about impartial laws, right? Not having your protected characteristics be relevant in how the laws are made. California, which is a super diverse, I think it's the most diverse and the most liberal state in the union, rejected a bill to bring back affirmative action, a ballot measure, where the yes side had a 19-to-1 spending advantage. And it was minority communities, especially Asian and Hispanic, that were some of the leaders, against it. So I guess should we all just chill out and let time kind of run its course, or are there specific things like rituals, like the Pledge of Allegiance, or specific things we can teach our kids? Is one of the questions that we got from the audience. What's your thought?
Do you want me to answer first, or do you want to?
You go for it.
I think that time is not on our side. I believe that we have a series of institutions in this country, whether it's political, economic, academic, institutions that have been completely infiltrated by people that do not share our values and are educating our kids with the wrong ideas. And I think some of that goes back to the point we were talking about earlier of to what extent we have a sense of self-belief and believing that America really is the best country in the world. If you are growing up in school and you're actually being told that, no, 1776 is not the founding of this country, it's 1619 when the first slave ships arrived, and there is that inherited sin you have from your forefathers, and actually we should be repenting of that and doing reparations and that kind of stuff. I think we are educating an entire generation of young children on ideas of guilt and shame rather than ideas of national pride and gratitude and patriotism. Thank you. And so I really think that those kids are going to grow up and they're going to feel alienated from the people that they live next to and near. They're going to feel alienated from the forms and rituals that have made this country a cohesive society for the last 250 years. And they're going to increasingly become atomized individuals that seek out their in-groups on social media, for example, and that's where they're going to find their people, rather than on the soccer field where you're all pledging, like singing to the national anthem. So I think there might be instances like what you said with Toronto where people can get along, but I think in the long run, this country is overrun with people that don't share our fundamental values, And in the long run, that's going to become a big
Just
problem.
to be clear, when you say people who don't share fundamental values, you're talking about the far left in institutions. You're not talking about, cultural backgrounds, right? Or are you?
What do you mean by that?
When you said there are people who don't share values of overrun institutions, you're thinking about like far left takeover of media, those kinds of things, not mass immigration.
Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, the people that are teaching other people, whether it's in journalism, whether it's in politics, whether it's in economics, whether it's in academia, I think you actually mentioned in your book that there used to be a much greater parity, like 2-to-1 with like liberal versus conservative professors in colleges. Now it's like 10-to-1, if not much more, in favor of liberal professors.
In some, it's infinity to zero. In some fields.
Right. But so if you grow up in that echo chamber and you're a young, impressionable person, you're growing up in a world where you're confused because we don't know what a man is and what a woman is, and there's just so many things happening with social media, depression and anxiety skyrocketing. You are going to be easily fed lies about this country, about yourself, about your neighbors, and I don't think anything good comes from that.
Konstantin, can I ask you a question about Europe? So I sometimes wonder, the optimistic story I told about Canada, and by the way, we don't just get along. Canada's pretty awesome. I'm patriotic about both my home country and my adopted country. I do sometimes wonder if countries like in Western Europe and Japan that were founded more as nation states than Canada or the US or Australia were, have a harder problem to solve here. What do you think?
Well, Britain has an imperial identity, and so to be British, you don't have to be English to be British. So in the UK, it's less of a problem. I actually was going to come back to the point you made about how this gets solved with time. I actually do think that's true, provided everybody assimilates. The problem is that if you have more and more people coming and they're not assimilating, over time, that's obviously going to get worse, not better. And the example would be, in the UK, for example, Muslims who are 20 and younger are far more extreme than their parents and grandparents in their attitudes.
And that stands in stark contrast, by the way, to American first-generation immigrants who tend to poll in many ways very similar to their native-born peers.
Right.
Partly because there is such expectation.
Well, this is my point, right? You don't have the same issues with Islam in this country, when one of the reasons is that the Muslim population here is incredibly well integrated by comparison. So it's not about the people, it's about, are they being integrated and assimilated into your society or not? And so you could bring in, 10 million Russians, and if you don't integrate them, you're going to have massive problems. Or you could bring in 10 million people from the Middle East, and if you integrate them, it's going to be just fine. It's about whether people adapt themselves to the society in which they live. And if they do, you're not going to have a problem over time. In fact, things will get better over time, as you mentioned. If you don't, things will naturally get worse over time.
I'm going to go to a question from the audience for both of you, and that is, how are you raising your children to have a strong sense of patriotism and a positive Western self-belief? What advice would you give to other parents to do the same? And feel free to make stuff up if you don't have kids.
Well, he doesn't have kids, and my son is 2 years old, so it's a little bit early for patriotism lessons for him.
No, it's not. What are you talking about?
We're trying to just get him to poop and pee where he's supposed to. That's
It's an American value.
Look, I actually don't think that, I have said for a long time that I think what colleges should do on a compulsory basis is, if you want to get an education, you have to spend a year somewhere like Africa. Travel. Go and see how people actually live in the rest of the world, and then come and tell me how terrible America is. Seeing is believing. Anyone who's been to any poor part of the world, which is every part of the world compared to the United States and Western Europe, is immediately shocked by how privileged they are on arrival. And so for my son, it's not going to be a problem, because he's going to be, on his grandparents' village in the Ukraine, and seeing how people, women in their 80s who are still carrying 2 buckets of water from the well. That's how most people live around the world. People go, oh, you've got this privilege, that privilege. The real privilege is Western privilege that we all have. To have electricity and running water and a roof over our heads and food to eat, too much food to eat, frankly, right? So seeing is believing, and if you have kids, just send them to Africa. I'm serious. Not permanently, just for a year. Although when they're teenagers, send them permanently. 'Cause they're
Relatedly,
annoying.
what do you think about the idea? Some people have called for the idea of a mandatory service year where you go to some other part of the United States and that's different from where you grew up. To now, you're not going to see how different other countries live from the United States, but in terms of supporting integration and supporting a shared American identity, seeing how other people live, seeing how, contact in equal setting is one of the things that psychologists find reduce intergroup conflict, right? If you have a roommate who's from another race, you're going to have less racial prejudice at the end of the year in colleges, studies have found. Do you support that kind of an idea?
Yeah, definitely, and it can take many different manifestations, right? It could be military service, it could be public service, it could be something else. I think Israel's a really good example of a country that can literally only survive because its people stick together. Because if they don't stick together, they will be overrun by their neighbors that don't like them so much. And one of the reasons for that, and I have many friends in Israel, and I've spoken there before, is because they have a military draft. And there are very few exceptions for that. And so you meet all people from all walks of society in the military draft, and you rally around the one thing, which is defend your community, defend your neighbors, defend the ideas that you love. And I think, obviously in America, maybe military draft doesn't make as much sense because you don't have an existential threat in the way Israel does. But there could be other forms of service, whether it's, I actually thought that the Civilian Conservation Corps we had under Teddy Roosevelt that built the national parks in many parts of this country was a great way for you to get out and see the country, meet other people, but also a big part, something that we would definitely benefit from now, people in my generation, is to be physically outside. Like do stuff with your hands, like whether it's building homes for the poor or cleaning up a park or whatever it might be. Just we're so stuck behind social media. We've curated our experience to the wars that we see on Twitter or Facebook or TikTok, and it's algorithmically fed to us all the time. So we have no clue what the real world looks like out there. And so I think it'd be an excellent idea. And that's why I actually really support missions trips. Like a lot of churches that send people to like Africa, to South America, to Asia, to help build orphanages, to help build schools, and to see what that looks like. I think that's hugely formative. My wife's in medical school. The reason she wanted to go into medical school was because she was feeding malnourished young African children and seeing how much we were lucky to have Western medicine, and she wanted to be part of that. I think that's how we need to bring up our children, and that's definitely how I plan to bring mine up.
Get cracking, man.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to another audience question. This says, question for Konstantin. I recall with the Black Lives Matter movement, which was related to police brutality, various football players were taking a knee during the Star-Spangled Banner. They never said they didn't love their country, they just had issues with it which they wanted to highlight. The center and far right, however, questioned their patriotism. So why only highlight outrageous patriotic statements from the far left? I think they mean anti-patriotic statements. The right is very guilty of this too. What's your response?
I don't understand how it's anti-patriotic to criticize people for taking the knee. It's a very American thing that see, what happened is this whole thing spread around the world into contexts in which it was very different. So in England, for example, and in much of Western Europe where we had feudalism, kneeling has a very clear and specific message, which is submission, right? From our perspective, from the outside, there was a kind of, when we saw our police officers, for example, kneeling to mobs, it looked like they were kneeling to them. Does that make sense? Now, I don't think that was the case with the American context, but I also, I'm not sure that disrupting one of the rare opportunities Americans have to come together, as Chris was describing, and to say, we're all one and we're all united by a common set of values. I'm not sure that is necessarily the most helpful place to raise that issue. It's a difficult one. I don't have I didn't have any particularly strong view on that, not least because I don't fully understand the local context for America and what exactly it means to be kneeling during that moment. So I never said anything about that in particular, and I don't have any kind of clear line on it.
Another audience question, which I'm going to rephrase a little bit. So one of the really interesting patterns in our politics right now is how a lot of the demographic party correlations that we used to have are changing very quickly. So for example, Trump is now polling at around 20% among Black Americans, where Republicans have not won more than 10% for a really long time. Since 2020, he's tripled his support among Black men and doubled it among Black Americans in general. Ron DeSantis won Hispanic Americans. I saw a poll that where it used to be that older Americans leaned significantly to the right, young Americans leaned significantly to the left. That's coming down in both directions. Among young people, men and women are diverging like never before, with men moving to the right and women moving to the left among young people. So do you see encouraging signs or worrying signs or both in terms of our coming together, right? So for example, on the one hand, the fact that the parties are becoming less racially sorted seems like a good thing. But what's your take on that? Does that seem relevant to the challenge that we have of coming together or not? And what do you think is driving it?
Well, I certainly don't think, no offense, but I don't think you're coming together. I think you're moving very much in the opposite direction from what I can tell. But I also think that's maybe quite a specific thing in the current, in the last 4 years, let's put it like this. Things have not gone well for the United States, whether geopolitically, economically, in many other ways. So the fact that people, even from minority groups who traditionally don't vote for Republicans, are moving in that direction, I think is probably more a reflection of just general fed-upness with what's going on, with inflation, with several foreign wars and the way that they're handled, et cetera. So I think, then again, I mean, it is amazing to me when people on the left go, I can't believe Hispanics are voting for the, it's like, have you looked at, they're mostly Catholic, their religion's pretty clear. It's not surprising they have some, at least small c conservative values. So, yeah, but I don't think it's accurate to say that you're coming together, I'm afraid.
Chris, what's your take?
I find it interesting, there's a graph for what Matt mentioned about how young women and young men are diverging, and it's literally like this, like they're going opposite directions. And I think that's partly a reflection of the way I think society has failed to grapple with masculinity and femininity. And I think we're seeing a lot of, like most of the minority groups that are polling for Trump tend to be men. And I think a lot of those men are fed up with kind of the left-wing narrative they've been fed for a very long time. But at the same time, I think the right is very bad at establishing emotional credibility with women, whether it's on issues like abortion or climate change, like issues that we know poll high for women. And so you have this like weird thing where men and women are being framed as opposites in society. They're very much framed as being antagonistic to one another rather than complementary. And add on top of that, kind of the blurring of lines of what gender even is and all that kind of stuff. I think I'm very worried about the future of that kind of political separation between men and women, and we need to find a way to bring it back together.
What about atomization? Social media seems relevant here too, right? Who would have thought that men and women would become divided when women are on Tumblr and men are watching porn, right? So Jonathan Haidt just published this very influential book called The Anxious Generation about how social media is having an effect on the mental health of young people, particularly young girls. And so I wonder, and people have also written about how social media and the internet have contributed to polarization. I wonder, do you two see any kind of role for social media reform in the project of building patriotism?
Well, and just preventing the ruin of Western society, yeah. We might be able to get Elon Musk on the show in the next few months, hopefully, and I'd love
Your show, not mine, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I'd love to ask him this, because I think it's undoubtedly the case that social media that's driven by pandering to our base instincts is how you get attention and clicks, but it's also clearly having a negative impact on our society. So I feel like this is an overused metaphor, but the invention of the printing press did the same thing to the fragmentation of our reality. So the fact that everyone has their own narrative now about reality of what truth is, it's like words. If you think about it now, words no longer have an agreed meaning on almost anything. For example, if you were to say to somebody, Joe Biden, or Donald Trump, or Chris Barnard, or Konstantin Kisin, or anybody, our idea of who that person is no longer remotely cohesive, because you've been fed your particular slant on that particular person by your social media algorithm, and I've been fed my particular slant on that particular person by my social media. So even when we use the same word, we don't mean the same thing anymore. Even when we use somebody's name, we don't mean the same thing. Even when we're talking about the same person, we're not talking about the same thing anymore. That's the level at which our reality is being fragmented. And the good thing about the printing press story, it had a very similar effect, and we survived. The bad news is, it caused 2 centuries of religious war. So that's kind of where we are. And so we are going to have to work out, as human beings, what is the correct relationship between social media platforms, increasingly AI, and our own brains. And that's a question we're going to be answering for a long time.
Can I just quickly hop
Yeah,
in
please
on that? So I was born in 1998, so I think I evaded most of kind of the social media generation of like kids that are literally brought up on it from a very, very young age. If I would have my way, I would honestly probably put pretty stringent regulations on minor access to social media. The UK is considering a ban for under 16s buying smartphones. Well, their parents probably.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Which is what Haidt recommends.
I think that's almost inevitable now.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, parents tend to be the ones that buy them, but I think directionally, it's a correct principle.
Yeah.
And I think like one of my friends, Connor, who was on your show recently, talked about kind of the Apple headset and how the AI kind of future could unfold. And to your point about like reality being fragmented, that might even to some extent become physical at some point. If you have a headset and your entire experience is curated within the confines of this physical thing on your head, and you're virtualizing everything, then your reality is completely different from everyone else's. So what even is reality anymore? You curate what you yourself want to see, and you don't have any accountability to the people around you. And that's really one of my biggest problems with social media. Is it's so easy to say the mean thing on social media or to go after someone because there's no accountability. There's no social accountability. If I'm face to face with you, I'm probably not going to say that, right? But if I can say it on social media, I'm going to do it. I think another really big problem, especially on Twitter right now or X, is kind of how widespread porn is on it. And I think that's something that a lot of young men struggle with. And I think a lot of these research shows that's linked to domestic abuse, that's linked to rape, that's linked to divorce. Like over half of men in this country who get divorced have an addiction to pornography. Why? Because they've curated their own reality and they have no sense of delayed gratification. It's only about what they want in that particular moment, rather than understanding that, like courtship is about actually establishing an emotional connection with someone before any of that. So I think our fundamental conceptions of reality, both metaphysical and physical, are completely being altered. And like kids that are being born now are growing up in that, and they won't know anything different. And I think it's a huge problem. And I think that's something, as a conservative, I believe that government should step in and figure out ways that we solve that.
Konstantin, how are you planning to address social media with your son?
Well, my wife is in charge of that, so if it's up to her, he's not going to get a smartphone until he's about 40. If she has her way. I mean, look, I don't think children should be using smartphones, but particularly, maybe not smartphones, but social media. I think there's probably a massive market opportunity. I know that there's ways to configure like iPhones to do this anyway, but if you were an entrepreneur who invented a phone for kids that did all the stuff that it needed to do, for example, like Google Maps, right? Like I would like my son to be able to navigate around, and not least because he's going to have to eventually, right? So it might have Google Maps, and it might have this, and might have that, but it won't have certain other things. It won't have access to adult content. It won't have access to social media. It won't have access to other things. I think that's going to have to be the way. We have to recognize that we've been participating in an involuntary experiment on our brains, and children are uniquely vulnerable to that. So I don't think my son's getting a phone, this type of phone that I have in my pocket until he's close to maturity.
I think part of the problem though is that parents, like everyone's probably seen like at a restaurant, parents like the young child cries, and so their answer is, rather than parenting the child, is to put an iPad in front of them to shut them up. I think there's a problem there where we're outsourcing parenting to technology and to iPads. And even if there were an entrepreneur coming up with the right phone for some parents that are like wired that way, I think a lot of parents probably still would take the easy option. And then the kids that go to their friend's house and they see like, oh, but mommy, my friend is allowed to have iPad time 3 hours a day, and I'm only allowed 10 minutes a day. Like there's that social contagion of this, which I think is frankly infesting young kids' minds, and a lot of parents are unfortunately caving to it.
One follow-up question about social media. There are several measures by which what we called cancel culture has receded a little bit in the last couple of years. Musa El-Garbi has written, he's a sociologist at Stony Brook, has written some good stuff on this. Do you think that any of that has to do with your generation, Chris, experiencing mutually assured destruction? Like before, so Facebook came into existence when I was in college, right? So I was the first, generation to have Facebook, but the retweet, the like button, didn't exist when I was as young and stupid as I was then, right? But now everybody's got dirt on everybody theoretically, right? And so do you think that your generation is in some ways against cancel culture more than my generation and Konstantin's generation because everyone has dirt on everyone and we can't live like this?
I think that might logically make sense, but in my own personal experience, having been canceled on my college campus in the UK, the weapon of cancel culture is so appealing and so easy for the wrong people to use that I think it's something that a lot of people in my generation are still willing to use. And I mean, we saw stories on my campus of people canceling others and then 2 months later being canceled themselves, right? Because things came out. And I think in a society that doesn't necessarily battle things out physically anymore, we battle things out through canceling each other, right? And I think it's a manifestation of a deeply unhealthy form of social relationships that we have with one another. But that's just my personal experience. I can't really speak to the research. I haven't read it. But I definitely think a lot of it still happens.
What I would say, I think the real reason cancel culture, if you say so, is maybe not as powerful as it was, is that we've made it not as powerful. If you get canceled now, it's very easy to make a career out of that.
Right, Jordan Peterson, who you were on tour.
Jordan
You were on
Peterson.
tour with, who was a normal person when I was in college at University of Toronto, where he's a professor.
Yeah, now he sells out basketball arenas.
Yeah, and he famously said once that he monetized social justice warriors.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the infrastructure is now there, whereby if you are a comedian or an academic or a journalist or a business person or whatever, and people come after you unfairly, and you're a reasonable, decent person who's doing the right thing, you're gonna, for all the way from Joe Rogan to down to whoever, you're gonna get opportunities to say your piece, and from that will flow all sorts of other things. There are alternative colleges being built as we speak. There are people who are building companies where you can come and work. 5 to 6 years ago, for example, if you were a video editor, let's say, and you were to be canceled from wherever place you worked, you really didn't have anywhere else to go. Right now, there's, in the UK alone, there's a dozen YouTube channels that would be glad to have you if you're any good, right? So the infrastructure is now there to essentially push back against all of this. And as, the mainstream media is still big and powerful. New media is still, I would say, in its nascent form, but moving. But what's happening is we're moving like this. And new media operates under a completely different set of rules. So over time, what you will start to see is the infrastructure that is now being built in a kind of anti-woke space, if you like. It will prevent people from being canceled as easily. And I've always said this, the only way cancel culture ends is when it ceases to be beneficial to cancel people. Like, if they knew that attempts to cancel somebody gave them $1 million in a new career, they'd stop canceling people.
Do you think this is, in a weird way, Western values and institutions solving this problem, right? The market competition in the case of media?
I think there's elements of that going on, definitely. I think that there are obviously institutions where that's going to be much, much harder. And I've always been extremely skeptical of the idea of what we call the blob in the UK, what you call the deep state here in the US. But it is a fact, and I speak to people in government, in various countries and whatever, about why they're not able to do the things that they want to do and get elected to do. And a big part of the reason is they have a massive bureaucracy that sits underneath that. The Liz Truss, who we just had on the show, the former Prime Minister of the UK, she basically described being Prime Minister as wearing a straitjacket, because the people who are supposed to implement the things you say have their own agenda. They're much more likely to be there longer than you are. They're guaranteed to be there longer than you are. You can't fire them, right? And so those institutions have an embedded worldview that's going to be much harder to shift. In the media ecosystem, absolutely, the market is having its way with the mainstream, which is why advertising sales are down, viewership is through the floor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is being shifted into new media. So if you run a new media podcast, you literally have no trouble selling advertising. If you are a mainstream media organization, your advertising sales are probably plummeting right now. So the market is working its way through, but the market only works in areas where the market is allowed to do its job.
Can I just quickly...
Sorry, we're actually out of time. But so I really quickly want to ask both of you. You both traveled pretty extensively in this country. What city or place is America's best kept secret and why? And keep it to 1 or 2 sentences if you can.
You have to go first.
Well, America is not a country, first of all. America is 50 countries. That's one of the things I've discovered in my travels. But it is. I mean, the difference between Utah and California is probably bigger than the difference between France and Italy, for example. Okay, sure, they speak the same language, but apart from that, the difference is much wider, religiously, culturally, in many other ways. The place the best kept, I don't know if it's a kept secret, and it's certainly not like the nightlife part of it that I enjoy, but New Orleans is one of the most beautiful places I've been, just because unlike many cities in the US, it has a historical center where the buildings are historically interesting and beautiful and appealing. So I've been there a couple of times and I've really enjoyed it.
Chris, what about you?
I would say that one of the cities that's actually been most successful in recent years is, I don't know if it qualifies as a city, but is Carmel in Indiana. I don't know if anyone's been there before, but it has a Republican mayor, but it's a city, so one of the few. And it's a genuinely well-organized, pretty city. It's implemented roundabouts instead of stoplights, which actually is hugely effective in traffic flowing. It's brought air pollution down because cars aren't idling as much.
You're going back to the motherland. I like it.
And lots of people are moving there because it kind of balances being in a city without all the nonsense that comes from being in a city nowadays, right? And I think a lot of Americans are realizing that we need to get out of the big cities and kind of be in more communal type towns that are growing. So I would say Carmel is like a good example of that. I like Colorado Springs as well a lot. Another one, I think there was recently a new mayor, but up until recently was also a Republican-led city and was quite popular for that. So those are my 2 cents.
Well, we're out of time. I encourage you all to get out, get off of social media, get out from behind your keyboards, go travel, meet fellow Americans, meet Canadians and Russians and Belgians.
Well, they did. That's why they're here.
And thank you all for coming out. And thank you. Thank you to the Benson Center for the great run that I've had here. And let's stay friends. Thanks, everybody.